Joining us right now with the Texas Tribune, it's Patrick Svitek. Patrick, good morning. How's it going today?
Good morning. How you doing? It's busy as usual.
Well, that's good. Yeah, it is busy. A lot of things happening, not only down in Austin but around the state. Let's focus first on something that went on down in Austin this week, and that was this talk about a new bathroom bill, a House version of the bathroom bill, and the governor has finally weighed in.
Yeah, so after months of silence on this issue, the governor came out with a statement that was a little bit cautious, but it appeared to signal support for this House alternative to what has so far been called the bathroom bill in the Senate. This is legislation, at least in the Senate, that would require transgender people in some places to use the bathroom that aligns with their what's called biological sex in the legislation. Now, the House has what they're pitching as kind of an alternative to this bill, and the authors of the House bill hope it'll be less controversial than that Senate bill. It kind of steps around the whole bathroom biological sex language and targets specifically cities that have non-discrimination ordinances and goes after that issue, which may be more in line with the revised, quote-unquote bathroom bill that we've seen in North Carolina. As you recall, there was a big uproar when North Carolina first passed that bill. They got a lot of pushback from the NCAA, and they've since revised the bill, and it's now satisfying the NCAA there. And so I think a lot of the supporters of this new House bill that the governor is signaling support for hope it'll be less contentious, less controversial, and more in line with what the NCAA has signed off on effectively in North Carolina. Personally, I think that remains to be seen. A lot of the people in the business and LGBT communities who opposed the Senate version of this bill are just as opposed to the House version, and some of them say it's even more restrictive or would be even more dangerous. So I don't know necessarily if the debate around this around this issue has changed with Abbott weighing in, but he definitely breathes new life into the legislative efforts to get it done.
So does the House version, when comparing the two, I know the Senate version said you have to use the bathroom in government buildings and government schools. You have to use the bathroom that corresponds with your biological sex. And then it went further and said businesses can basically set their own policy, that local communities can't force businesses to, if we can't force businesses to abide by a city policy on transgender or on bathroom policy. The House version cuts out the first part, but just says, hey, businesses, it's up to you what you want to do with your bathrooms. Is that basically all the House version does?
That is my understanding. I think the key part of there is that it cuts out that first part. It doesn't include that controversial language that requires people to use public bathrooms that correspond with the sex on the birth certificate. It instead just goes after cities and bans them from adopting non-discrimination ordinances that would or could apply to restrooms. And so it really tries to kind of step around the whole very bathroom and transgender-specific issue that is raised in at least the Senate bill.
Interesting. Well, I guess we'll see what happens with that if it does really gain any new life in the House and Senate. There was an overnight hours-long hearing on the House alternative this week. The bill was left pending, but like I said, a lot of the arguments you heard for and against it really mirrored the Senate debate over this. So I don't know if the battle lines have changed significantly. Do you know, have we heard anything from the lieutenant governor or from anyone on the Senate side? Because, I mean, if the House passes the House version, the Senate passes the Senate version, there's going to have some compromise. I mean, have we heard from anyone on the Senate side about this House version?
No, I mean, the lieutenant governor, who's made this issue a priority this session, has been very visible on it. Has been kind of, I would say, conspicuously silent on this House bill. He hasn't publicly commented on it. You've seen some conservative lawmakers in the House who are kind of ideological allies of Dan Patrick say they're glad to see the House is at least trying to make some movement on this issue. But I would not say you've necessarily seen Dan Patrick and his allies rally around this House bill. I think they're probably waiting to see how this debate plays out, what the House decides to do with this bill, and what the ultimate kind of final product is. Because, as you know, I mean, they've been working very hard on this issue in the Senate, have faced a lot of controversy, and so I think they're probably going to be very cautious before they abandon that proposal altogether.
Right. The other big issue, I would say, that happened down in Austin this week, in the House at least, was school finance. And of course, Dan Huberty and Jonathan Stickland getting along at times during that debate. I think that was the other piece of big news. But can you tell our audience a little bit about what went on during the school finance debate and what that may look like going forward?
Yeah, so, Huberty is the chair of the Public Education Committee in the House, and he had made it a big priority this session to at least begin the process of overhauling the school finance system without a court mandate, which is it's a little hard sometimes to get lawmakers to act in Austin, as you know, on some of these big issues unless there's a court mandate. But they did that just this week. They passed out this major school finance overhaul that was led by Huberty. It was 134 to 16 vote, at least on the tentative approval. It was ultimately finally approved by a similar margin on Thursday, I believe. There was a 3-hour discussion, over 30 amendments. But I think besides the fact that it was so long of a debate, it was rather smooth sailing, and it is certainly an accomplishment for the House, which has tried to tackle this in the past and has gotten tripped up or has just not been able to pull it off in time. And so it's going to be fascinating to see how this is received in the Senate. Some senators and Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor who presides over the Senate, have said they agree there's a need to tackle this issue, but they've also suggested that one of their bigger priorities in education is school choice, which, as we've discussed before, is effectively dead this session through the maneuver that the House used to amend its version of the budget. And also Dan Huberty had started the session by saying it's basically dead on arrival in the House. So there could be some interesting gamesmanship going on as these two big education ideas collide at the end of the session.
Definitely. We're visiting with Patrick Svitek, Texas Tribune. You covered Bernie Sanders. He was in my hometown of Grand Prairie yesterday and fired up, I guess, the Democrat. He's on, what is this, the Democrat Unity Tour? Is that what it is?
Yeah, this is a nationwide tour with Bernie Sanders, obviously the former presidential candidate, the independent senator from Vermont, and then the new members of the DNC leadership team. If you recall, they elected a new chair, Tom Perez, the former U.S. Labor Secretary, about 2 months ago. They've also installed Keith Ellison, who also ran in that race, as kind of his number two. Unfortunately, neither of them made it to the rally in Grand Prairie. There was a DNC vice chair there instead. But people were really excited to see Sanders. I mean, it was a pretty big crowd. I think by one count, 2,000 people. Obviously, Sanders has a very devoted following wherever he goes, and those people were out in force yesterday. It was interesting, though, not a lot of Texas-specific talk, which was a little remarkable considering the fact that Democrats in Texas and even nationally have said that Texas was kind of a bright spot for them in the presidential race. If you recall, it was the closest race in the state, I think, since 1996 in 2 decades. The Sanders speech yesterday was much more about him laying out his vision for the principles that the Democratic Party should stand for going forward. No coincidence that those principles were very much in line with the very progressive populist campaign that he ran last year. So that was kind of the big theme yesterday.
So it really wasn't that's interesting that it wasn't rallying Texas Democrats for defeating Ted Cruz. I mean, was Ted Cruz brought up? I mean, was it made just national?
There were some very vague mentions of Texas, but Ted Cruz wasn't brought up, which was interesting considering he already has a Democratic challenger. Greg Abbott, curiously, was brought up. He's someone who, will probably have maybe a token Democratic opposition, but otherwise he's looking very safe for 2018. And so, again, I thought it was interesting that just didn't come up in a prominent way. Yeah. And it was an interesting contrast with Hillary Clinton's speech earlier this month in Houston. She spoke to Annie's List there, a group that works to elect Democratic women, and her speech was like chock full of references to specific candidates, specific state lawmakers. She really knew her stuff and then really did a good job, I think, in that speech of getting Texas Democrats specifically fired up about the future of their party and their state.
Does Bernie know that he lost? Does he think? Do we think that maybe he still thinks he's running for president right now? Maybe that's it.
I think that after the election, there's been a bit of a, to take that lighthearted question very seriously, I think there's certainly been a bit of a leadership back in the Democratic Party the election, and he's been more happy to step into it and try to reshape the party in his image. I mean, he's been very forceful, and I think this tour is the latest example of that. Yeah,
it's a battle for the Democratic Party, basically.
Absolutely.
Patrick, what are people looking forward to next week in the legislature? What are you working on yourself for TexasTribune.org?
Sure. So it looks like there's going to be a vote on the House floor next week on anti-sanctuary cities legislation. That's a huge priority of the governor. There's been a little controversy over the less stringent version that the House has come up with, at least in the eyes of some conservative lawmakers. So that debate will be fascinating to watch. You'll obviously have some conservative criticism of that bill, and then you'll have the usual Democratic criticism of that bill. So that'll be a fascinating debate. And then next week we may get a decision. This is an issue outside of Austin, perhaps. But a decision from Joaquin Castro on whether he's going to take on Ted Cruz in 2018. He has said that he'll decide by the end of April, although he was at an event in San Antonio this week and seemed to move that deadline maybe a little into May. So we'll see if he comes up with something next week.
Very good, Patrick. Have a good weekend, and we'll visit next week.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. That's Patrick Svitek, TexasTribune.org.